Hello, everyone. My name is Valerie Cordero, and I am Co-Executive Director of Families for Depression Awareness. I am so excited to welcome you to our webinar entitled, What's My Role? Helping Your Loved One Manage Depression Treatment. So your presence here, it really demonstrates your desire to support someone in your life, and I think that's pretty wonderful. So we're so appreciative of your presence here. We're going to have a program for about an hour and a half. So hopefully you have your dinner ready or your lunch ready or whatever meal you have, and you are going to be with us. We're going to be pulling questions from you all that you submitted at registration, as well as questions that are submitted throughout the program. So if you want to submit a question as we're going along, feel free to use the question and answer function here in Zoom. We have a lot of information to share with you, and we really encourage you to take notes, follow along in the chat as we put in links to important information. There will also be a link to the slides for this presentation, so you can feel free to download those slides, print them, and refer to that information at a later date. We also want to encourage you to fill out our evaluation at the end of the webinar. We really do value your feedback. We use it to improve our programs, change our focus, figure out what we should do next. So please do that, and you will, if you do fill out the evaluation, you will receive some of our publications, and I will give you more details about that later. You'll hear me say multiple times to also explore our website. Hopefully our website is how you registered for this webinar, but we have a lot of tips for how to support a loved one living with depression, tips for supporting a loved one living with a different mood disorder, and information about how you can get involved in Families for Depression Awareness. So don't forget familyaware.org. If our webinar is helpful to you, we really hope you share it. Send the link, tell somebody about it. This information doesn't have to just live with you. It can live with others, your coworkers, other family members. So please do share the information that you learned today. The last thing I'll say is that we are a nonprofit organization and we love getting donations. So if you are moved by, touched by, educated by something today, and you so choose, you can make a donation at familyware.org, and it would be tax deductible. We would really appreciate it. So thank you so much. You should have already seen and filled out a poll asking you about how much you know about this topic. We see that here are the results. A few people know a lot. Some people know a good amount. 47% of you know some about depression treatment and supporting a loved one. And then some of you don't know too much, and that's okay. We welcome all of you. Hopefully, no matter where you are on that knowledge spectrum, you learned something today. So appreciate all of you being here. So before we get into the presentation, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about Families for Depression Awareness. Our mission is to help families recognize and cope with depression and bipolar disorder to get people well and prevent suicides. We focus on the family caregiver because we believe that that person, the husband, the wife, the father, the sibling, the cousin, that those people who are around the loved one living with a mood disorder, they have a really important role to play in helping that loved one on that loved one's path to achieve the wellness that they desire for themselves. And so we work to educate, train, support those family caregivers, and sometimes even tell them, hey, you are a family caregiver. That's you who we're talking about. And here are some practical things that you can learn, actionable advice that you can take so that you are playing a positive role and really supporting that loved one living with a mood disorder. And we know that mood disorders affect the whole family, not just the person who is living with or diagnosed with a mood disorder, but it affects everybody. So everybody has a role to play in helping that loved one. We have a wonderful, new, spanking new, beautiful website, familyware.org. This is a shot of that website. We do encourage you to spend time there. It is the hub of all of our resources. You will find things like our free online tests. National Depression Screening Day is either today or tomorrow. I forget which day it is, but you don't have to it does not have to be National Depression Screening Day for you to take our test to screen for depression depression or bipolar disorder. They are validated tests based on the PHQ-9 and the MDQ. We also offer a caregiver stress test that will give you results that suggest other tools you can use depending on your stress level. So you can find those on our website. You will also find our publications, including the 3 publications that we will give away if you fill out our evaluation. You can also order these publications in bulk for your library, for your facility, for your school. So you can find that on our website. And we have so much more there. I'd like to just go over our agenda for today with you. We are going to get an overview of depression treatment and mental health care that will kind of set the stage for the rest of the presentation. Then we're going to look at what depression treatment actually entails in detail. We will then talk about how you assess treatment, what treatment is right, what kind of treatment providers, give you some tips on how you can support your loved one. We will end with additional resources, and then we'll do the Q&A before requesting that you fill out our survey one more time. So that is our agenda for today. Now it is my distinct pleasure to introduce our 2 presenters, Dr. Philip Wang and Dr. Maureen Clark. Dr. Philip Wang is a professor of the practice of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School and directs a new learning health system center at Mass General Brigham. He has served as Deputy Director of the National Institute of Mental Health and as Deputy Medical Director and Director of Research for the American Psychiatric Association. Dr. Wang has been awarded grants from CMS, NIMH, NIDA, AHRQ, and the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. And he has served on FDA advisory committees for psychopharmacologic drugs, medical devices, as well as endocrinologic and metabolic drugs advisory committee. He completed his undergraduate, medical school, master's, and doctoral degrees in epidemiology, as well as psychiatric residency and chief residency, all at Harvard University. We will also have the pleasure of hearing from Dr. Maureen Clark, who is the BSW Program Director and an Assistant Professor in the Social Work Department at Westfield State University. She graduated with her PhD in Social Work from the UConn School of Social Work and received her MSW from Springfield College School of Social Work. Dr. Clark has extensive experience working with children, adolescents, and adults dealing with a range of clinical needs in both outpatient and inpatient settings. She held multiple roles in crisis services, including as a child and adult trained crisis clinician, shift supervisor, and the staff development and clinical supervisor. Dr. Clark has been a passionate advocate and proponent for continued learning for delivery of best practices. Her current research focuses on promoting the voices of those with lived experiences of involuntary civil commitment in Massachusetts. So excited to hear from you both. First, we're going to hear from Dr. Philip Wang. Dr. Wang, welcome.
Thank you so much, Val. So I guess as the poll, I guess there's going to be another poll, but what I'd like to first do is just set the stage for some basic facts about treatment for depression and other mental health conditions, and give us a sense of much of the work that needs to be done. Next slide. So there's each year about 60 million individuals experience a mental disorder, including over 10 million that experience the most serious and impairing forms of mental illness, what we call serious mental illness. And depression is but it's a very common one, and it's often comorbid. That means it co-occurs with other mental disorders, things like substance use disorders, other conditions. And as you can see, over 8% or 21 million Americans are affected each year. The factors that can contribute to depression include, yes, some genetics, other brain systems. There's, though, often at the heart of many people's conditions are the experience of trauma and other adverse social conditions. These are what we call social determinants of health. And these often strike people very young. And what happens is it disrupts the normal development of brain systems that underlie your ability to think, cognition, your mood, and also behavior. And you see there some of the adverse social conditions that in addition to trauma, that can cause this disruption. Next slide. Um, so as I mentioned, that it's very common to have co-occurring diagnoses. In fact, the majority of individuals with depression and other substance use disorders actually experience more than one mental health condition. So comorbidity is the rule, not the exception. It's very disruptive. Depression, other mental disorders, in part because they occur so early. The median age of onset, believe it or not, is age 14. And as you can imagine, that affects your ability to meet school milestones, work milestones, social milestones, such that psychiatric disorders are actually the leading cause of disability in the United States. And they account for over a third of years lived with disability worldwide. As you can see, conditions like depression also complicate chronic medical conditions, either because they make it harder to treat those conditions or can actually contribute to disability. Again, the impairments from conditions like depression are quite severe. I don't need to mention, as Val did, that suicide is a significant risk, with individuals with depression and other mental disorders too, so there's a tremendous need to treat depression as a way also of preventing suicide and self-harm. Next slide. So about 66% of people with depression receive treatment, and that may sound okay, but it actually is less than you think. The treatment, before I went to the National Institute of Mental Health, I had the privilege of working on a large epidemiologic study in which we looked at the proportion of people who not only got treated, but got treated with what is called minimally adequate treatment. This is treatment that has a chance of getting you better, and what proportion of people who got minimally adequate treatment actually recovered. And it follows what has been called the rule of halves for treatment. And you're going to hear from Dr. Clark about another rule of halves, but this is regarding treatment. And what we found is that fewer than half of people who experience a mental disorder receive any care at all. Of those that receive any care, fewer than half receive that minimally adequate treatment that I talked about. And of those that receive minimally adequate treatment, fewer than half fully recover in terms of functioning. However bad that situation is for the general public, it's even worse for people of color. African Americans are only half as likely to receive any mental health services as white Americans, and Asian American and Hispanic Americans are only a third as likely to receive any mental health services as white Americans. Another issue, as I mentioned, is because of this early age of onset, you really have to get there very early. Despite the median age of onset of being 14, by that I mean half of cases of mental disorders, including depression, actually onset by age 14, 3/4 onset by age 24. So it's unlike these are unlike any other conditions, which usually strike you later in life. So the fact that these have such early ages of onset, it's especially problematic that there's on average a 10-year delay before individuals are actually diagnosed and receive treatment. So, and in that intervening time, as you can imagine, disability starts setting in. And so we need to get there earlier. We need to screen earlier. We need to get people properly diagnosed and treated more quickly. There's, needless to say, there's not enough behavioral health providers, and that is actually problematic. And we're going to talk about one potential solution to that. Um, the cost of care and lack of insurance. Now, with the Affordable Care Act, some of that has gotten better, but there still are individuals who don't have insurance, and that can be a deterrent to seeking care. You see up there some other factors that also lead to undertreatment. One is mistrust, particularly in communities of color who have had reason to mistrust healthcare, and so that contributes often to delays and hesitancy in seeking mental health care. And then there's stigma. While as we currently are having a much more of a public dialogue around mental health needs and the need for treatment, that has not always been the case, and there still is a lot of stigma associated with experiencing mental disorders. Next slide. So the pandemic has really brought out how these unmet needs for mental disorders. So as bad as the unmet needs were that I just described, they've gotten worse in terms of uh, uh, mental mental disorders such as depression. the uh, and in some ways good, and in some ways not so good. But the not so good, well, let me start with the good. Again, as I mentioned, there's much more discussion. I'm sure you're aware of the need to treat mental illness like depression, and that this has value. That this isn't some kind of a moral failing or people just not pulling themselves up by this bootstrap, but that this is care. This is medical care. This is healthcare, and you wouldn't deny healthcare for other conditions. So public opinion is changing. There's also on the positive side, there's been a rapid adoption of new services like telehealth. And I previously had, before starting this new center at Mass General Brigham, I was the chair and chief of psychiatry at Cambridge Health Alliance. And within the first week of COVID, we transformed from seeing about 2,500 outpatient visits in person to exclusively seeing folks via telehealth. And that was a dramatic change within the course of a week. And what was interesting was the no-show rate when we switched dropped by half. It was decreased by half, meaning people, it seemed, to welcome mental health services delivered via telehealth. Now, these might not be perfect, but again, it's a way to potentially increase access. And they were covered by insurance. So it'll be important to continue, hopefully, to have those services reimbursed. Now, here's some of the bad news. There was obviously an increase in need. The CDC reported that during COVID, the experience of depression and anxiety disorders increased. About a third of people were reporting significant symptoms. About half reported trauma or stressor related symptoms, conditions. There was increased substance use. There was increased experience of suicidality. And this led to a surge in things like visits to emergency rooms. So in children and adolescents, the proportion of emergency room visits during COVID increased by a quarter in children and by a third in adolescents. And that had downstream ramifications. There were no inpatient beds for kids in crisis. And so often there would be emergency room boarding, often for weeks for youth and adults across the state of Massachusetts and really nationally. Next slide. So let's talk about evidence-based depression treatment. One form is talking therapies. These are otherwise, sometimes you hear them referred to as psychological or psychosocial interventions. And in this case, there are some evidence-based psychotherapies that have been really rigorously studied. And so they've been proven to improve depression symptoms. And one that you may have heard, it's often referred to by its acronym CBT. This is cognitive behavioral therapy. Another is it's called IPT, interpersonal psychotherapy. There's also MBCT, mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. And I know for those of you who mindfulness-based cognitive therapy may sound, a little bit less rigorous. Well, actually, believe it or not, it is very well studied. And in fact, in the UK, the United Kingdom, they have a single payer system, and it's called the National Health Service. And they have guidelines, and their number one recommendation for people who've had depression for relapse prevention is actually mindfulness-based cognitive therapy because of the strength of the evidence. There's medication, different pharmacologic treatments, and this is going to sound, if you thought those acronyms were bad, well, this is even worse. So don't necessarily focus too much on them, but there's selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, SSRIs. These are medications like Prozac. You may be familiar with that. Serotonin norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors, SNRIs, norepinephrine dopamine reuptake inhibitors, NDRIs, and there are other medications that have also been found to be useful for some people with depression. Next slide. The issue still to be worked on in research is, well, number one, as you were hearing, not everyone recovers. Not everyone fully functions after treatment. And so we're trying to, in research, we're trying to understand how do we develop even more effective treatments, more effective psychotherapies, more effective potential medications, other forms of treatment. There are ways to use magnetic fields to stimulate the brain. There are other promising techniques coming down the pike. And the reason why this is necessary is, as I mentioned, not everyone recovers on current treatments, and it's even more complex than that. The different people might respond to different types of treatments, so that often what a clinician will do is they'll try a treatment, but if it's not working, they'll have to try to switch you. So you may not get it right the very first time, and often it will require different rounds of different treatments while the clinician is trying to see which one might you respond to. And we don't have good ways to match yet. In other words, know right up front who's going to respond to what particular treatments. That's called personalization, and that's another big area for research. As you can imagine, as the evidence changes and as studies are done and results are found, this changes what guidelines recommend that clinicians should do. And so, the field is evolving as more research is being done. Next slide. Okay, this is where I stop, but thank
Yes,
you all.
but we're Dr. Wang, since you were having a little bit of technical difficulty, I want to give you the opportunity. Do you want to say anything else about transforming mental health care and collaborative care, what can be done in primary care settings, and how assessments for treatment of mild to moderate depression can happen in primary care before we move on to the next section?
Sure, if I have time, and I'm sorry if I gave it short shrift because I couldn't see the slide. I apologize. So collaborative care is it's an evidence-based model. There have been between 80 to 100 randomized controlled clinical trials of them, and I had the privilege of actually being able to conduct one of those, and I'll tell you a little bit about it. What it is what happens is you have primary care and mental health specialists, as I said, working in a team. So it's not just a single psychiatrist or a single therapist. You're working in a whole team. And in primary care, often what will happen is you'll be screened. And many of you who get your primary care, maybe you have filled out a PHQ-9. What that is the primary care team trying to see if you have depressive symptoms. And if you have depressive symptoms, that meet the criteria for depression, well, they'll do a more formal evaluation. And if they'll probably discuss treatment with you. If you're doing relatively well on that treatment, uh, maybe the only person you'll see is your primary care doctor, right? But let's say you're not getting well, or maybe you experience some more severe symptoms. For example, let's say you start developing suicidal thoughts. What will happen is the team, including the care manager and the primary care doctor, might reach out to, say, a psychiatrist and say, would you mind consulting on this individual? They're already part of the team, so it's not like they have to go get a referral or something. That they're already there, and they might assess you, and they might, if it's very complex, they may take over your care. They might actually, for example, start making recommendations for say your medication, or maybe they'll say maybe you should add psychotherapy to this, or that sort of thing. So it's very promising. It has been shown in these 80 to 100 trials to significantly improve depressive symptoms. That's not been in doubt. It also improves functioning, and the one trial I had the privilege of working in on was done in workers, people who were employed, and we also wanted to know whether it helped them function. Did they do better at work? And we found that collaborative care significantly improved your absenteeism and your presenteeism. So it actually helps improve functioning. But what's really interesting in terms of the disparities I talked about, collaborative care is maybe the only thing that has very strong evidence to actually mitigate disparities. And there are a number of reasons why, in part because you're measuring. Often, sometimes, and this is not to blame clinicians, we all have implicit biases. And the way they play out often is sometimes certain groups may not get treated as intensively, or maybe people don't ask, or for whatever reason. When you measure with a PHQ-9, that's indifferent to someone's race or ethnicity if you require it of everyone, right? And then if someone's not doing well, that's not a judgment call. The measure is showing it, right? And in that way, we did a systematic review. Our trainees did one of collaborative care, and it is probably, again, the only intervention we know of that has really robustly been shown to close disparities, actually, preferentially improve the care and outcomes of racial and ethnic minorities. Is that good, Valerie?
That's perfect. That's
Right.
we just
Okay.
didn't want people to miss that good information and your knowledge. All right, thank you, Dr. Wayne. We are now going to hear from Dr. Clark.
All right, hello. Hello, everyone. I'm very happy to be here with you today. And as you can see on the screen in front of you, we're going to start with a poll. I'm just looking to see how familiar you are with different treatments for depression. So if you would just take a couple seconds to fill that out, and then we will look at the answers together. Okay, so we can see here about 14% feeling extremely familiar, some somewhat familiar, slightly familiar, kind of making the bulk, those middle ones there. And then those of you that are not familiar at all, welcome. This will be a very informative portion for you. I think it's great to have this kind of mix of experience, and also it makes me just think about that even when you have a lot of knowledge or you have a lot of experience with different types of treatments, that there's always something to learn. As Dr. Wang referenced, levels of care or treatments are coming out all the time, things are changing, but we also know that people have different treatment experiences. And so just because you worked with one provider or one agency and have this understanding doesn't mean it's going to be exactly the same somewhere else. And so just kind of holding that reality for ourselves and our loved ones as we're kind of helping them navigate this complex system. One thing I'd like to add before I jump into this slide is that I am here tonight in a professional capacity, but I'd like to share that I'm also a person who's a family member of somebody who has struggled for many years with depression. I've been a primary support to them, and have really kind of gone through it in terms of navigating treatment across the spectrum. And so I always like to carry that lens with me, because I don't know, sometimes I think as providers, when we talk about accessing care, we make it sound easy. And it's far from easy. I know that, I'm sure many of you know that it's complex. And I appreciate, even with my knowledge and training and the resources that are at my disposal, how difficult it can be. So I just like to share that with you all. Before I delve into the content that I'll be just addressing, I want to preface this with sharing or an acknowledgement that in my experience, there are two kind of great flaws within our mental health delivery system. The first is that the system tends to locate problems within the individual. We decontextualize people's problems. We heard from Dr. Wang that we're seeing shifts in that, thinking about social determinants of health and looking at the things that people struggle with external to them that may be impacting and weighing on them and impacting their mental health. We're doing better with that. But historically, we've really looked to individuals to say, this is your problem. And what that does is it puts the responsibility then on them to fix it, right? And that's a big thing to carry as well, especially when it's a mix between what's happening internally and then what's kind of compounding that or contributing to that externally. And even though the system is individualizing the problem, we don't tailor treatment to the individual. So that's really important. The treatments that we have can be wonderful, but they're not one size fits all. And so part of this complex system is really, how do we navigate all of this to find what is right for that individual, for your loved one? So the next few slides, I'm going to look more broadly at different treatment options, or what we call levels of care. You can see here on the screen before you that levels of care really look at or discuss intensities of efforts required to either diagnose, treat, preserve, or maintain an individual's mental health status. When I talk about levels of care, I'm going to do so in a somewhat linear fashion, but people don't tend to access them in this order. It would be ideal if we could, that people would move from level of care to level of care depending on their needs, but often the lack of availability or being able to access at the right time makes that really impossible. So it's a significant barrier that people encounter. All of these levels of care that we'll talk about would be appropriate to address depression and other mood-related disorders, depending on what the person is experiencing, what their symptoms are, their particular diagnosis. As I discuss each one, I will try to present a general picture of, when the level of care most likely would be utilized, when you might consider looking at another level of care. I also want people to be aware that for more information that I'm talking about, you can always consider calling like a 211 line to learn about services that are available kind of locally to you. Insurance carriers can be wonderful resources, and we'll talk about that a little bit more, as are crisis services, which we'll also talk about. So outpatient treatment, this is the most available and most common treatment setting or type of treatment that exists. I think there's something like 11.6 million mental health treatment facilities in the US, and about 77% of those offer outpatient treatment. So this really refers to treatments that provide either individual, group, family type therapies that are delivered kind of maybe once a week, once every other week, or if someone has sustained a little bit of recovery, maybe they're in what we call maintenance treatment and they're going, once a month. Sometimes that happens. And this would be with, we use terms like therapist, counselor, psychologist, social worker, people with different disciplines that can offer outpatient treatment. This would also include medication management through a prescriber. Outpatient is well suited for people who are presenting with kind of mild to maybe moderate symptoms, but are functioning outside of the treatment setting fairly well. So they're in their home, they're overall taking care of themselves. Maybe they are attending school or work. For the most part, being able to meet kind of regular daily obligations. People come to outpatient with a wide variety of issues. So, the spectrum is really large, looking at issues of divorce, of trauma, of loss of a loved one, major life changes. It's really appropriate for a lot of different reasons. And sometimes we see that people access outpatient treatment because they're trying to maintain mental health after a higher level of care, what we call a higher level of care. So maybe they were in a hospital setting and now are being referred either to outpatient treatment for the first time or returning to outpatient providers. It really is our least restrictive level of care because people can really come and go in their lives and be part of treatment in a way that offers them confidentiality, privacy, because it's not disrupting their lives for the most part in other ways. Outpatient settings provide certain types of therapies, some of which Dr. Wang referenced. And oftentimes there are agencies or organizations that will provide multi-practitioner opportunities where individuals, if this isn't the right person for you or the right treatment modality, you can move to work with someone else. Or you can also be engaged in different types of outpatient treatment where within the same agency, you have an individual provider, a family provider, and maybe someone's attending groups. So taking a step back for a moment, treatment settings for mental health are often kind of categorized either as outpatient or inpatient, but we do have these in-between type settings. So these are treatment settings that technically are outpatient services in that the person goes home at some point, that they're not living at the treatment facility, but they offer a more intense level of care. They're usually much more comprehensive, very structured programs that offer a variety of therapies from kind of individual work, counseling support, other holistic treatments, and tend to have a lot of group support as well. So intensive outpatient programming is one of these in-between type settings. It is a higher level of care than outpatient, and it involves typically individuals who are going, they don't want to disrupt maybe their workday. So some of the programming is happening after hours in the evening, so they can still attend work or school or other obligations during the day, but go and receive treatment for a couple hours in the evening, doing a mix of, like it says here, individual group therapy, life skill classes, and so forth. Usually the terms IOP are referencing individuals who are seeking substance use treatment along with having co-occurring mental health symptoms. But I like to mention it because I know that depression and substance use often can be comorbid. And so this would be one of the treatment options for kind of a moderate level of care. Partial hospitalization programs are also one of these in-between settings. They're sometimes called day programs. And these are much more focused on mental health diagnoses specifically and not so much on substance use. These involve participants attending 6+ hours a day, most days of the week, providing kind of support during most of the day, a lot of group programming, and then individuals go home at night. Usually this lasts 2 weeks at a time, maybe 3, depending on what somebody's dealing with. Oftentimes people, if available, can access this as a step down from the hospital or as kind of a preventative level of care from being hospitalized. This level of care does create a barrier for people that when you're involved in a partial hospitalization program, if you have an ongoing outpatient treatment provider, you typically cannot do both at the same time. So you can't be going to partial hospitalization and seeing your therapist during that 2 or 3 week time. That's helpful for people to know, because that disruption in ongoing treatment, can feel startling for folks. So at this point, I'm including emergency service programs, often referred to as crisis services. They are not a level of care, but interaction with them is necessary to access the following levels of care that I'm going to talk about. So we think it's important to know about them. So emergency service programs, ESPs, are 24/7 assessment programming for individuals who are experiencing a mental health or psychiatric emergency or crisis. The term crisis, I think, can be really subjective. And having done this work, it's really important that we expand our definition of crisis and not be narrow in defining it and what that might look like for someone. Having said that, individuals who often seek out crisis services or end up being seen by a crisis team do so typically because they're having suicidal thoughts. Maybe they've taken some actions or made a suicide attempt. So, this service is really reserved for people who are experiencing mental health symptoms that are impairing their ability to stay safe, whether that's intentional or not. So we may see major disruptions in caring for oneself, not taking, medications, not addressing medical conditions that then could be life-threatening or life-altering, engaging in substance use that also impacts safety. So someone might not be at risk because of their intentional actions, but they're so impacted by their mental health symptoms that they're unsafe in other ways. So typically that's what's going on when someone, whether it's the individual themselves, a family member, a provider, reaches out to crisis services. I really like to frame it for people because crisis sounds really overwhelming and not super strengths kind of rooted. So I like to say that, a person needs crisis services when their needs or challenges are exceeding their strengths in any given moment, or the strengths of their systems, right? So a lot of times as caregivers, we're providing the support, but it's overwhelming to us as well. And so when that happens, there's this imbalance that creates a dynamic that a crisis may occur, that something, more significant, more imminent, and more unsafe may occur. So ESPs typically are needed to access the levels of care that I will talk about, but that doesn't mean to utilize them, you have to exactly be at that point. They're also a resource for people. They can help with outpatient referrals. You can call and say, I'm looking for an outpatient provider. They can help with connecting you with these in-between services, the IOPs and the partial hospitalizations. And they're also there as support. Many have hotlines. Many can walk you through kind of navigating these different processes. So typically used in emergency situations, but you don't have to wait for that time to reach out to them. So as I said, ESPs help individuals access what we call higher levels of care or more restrictive levels of care. And these are settings that remove people from kind of their everyday life, their living situations, and move them into treatment settings. So the first of these is a community-based crisis stabilization unit. These are, sometimes these are referred to as respites. And these are alternatives to psychiatric hospitalization. They occur in community settings, so they're not in hospitals. They're typically attached to community mental health agencies, but they present as much more home-like settings. This is a voluntary level of care, so no one can be forced to receive treatment at a CCS. And because it's voluntary, it's an unlocked level of care. So When safety concerns arise, when things become a little bit more severe, they may need to refer then back to a crisis service if they can't kind of manage someone there. The average stay is 3 to 5 days, and they will provide, similar to inpatient settings, apologize for my dog, groups, individual medication management. Even though it's a voluntary level of care, individuals do have to stay there. So they can't just come and go. You can't go to work. You need to be there experiencing and engaging in all of the different treatment that they offer. But people often can leave if they have an appointment. If it's something really specific, especially as they may be transitioning out and resuming treatment with other providers in the community. So this works well for individuals experiencing what we would call moderate symptoms, moderate to severe, but cannot be presenting, as I said, with imminent risk. Safety, like imminent safety, cannot be a concern. But someone that needs more support and monitoring than maybe a partial setting where, they're going home, or an outpatient setting, they need kind of more of that wraparound 24/7. This would be a really great option. And it's also really helpful because it's for people who might be isolating a little bit more, similar with the partial hospitalization. It can help with socialization and being part of groups that might pull people a little bit out of the isolation that they may be experiencing. So I added in enhanced acute treatment services, sometimes referred to as EATS. This terminology might be state specific to Massachusetts, but I do think that there's probably similar levels of care in various states across the US. And I add it in here because, as I said, there's a high comorbidity of mental health, depression specifically, and substance use. So this is also a more substance use focused level of care, but individuals do meet with a psychiatrist for medication management and do have some one-on-one programming, and some of the group content may also include then mental health symptoms that they're experiencing. It's a similar structure to the Crisis Community Stabilization Unit. In this placement, individuals can detox and then step over to a community crisis stabilization unit if a bed is available, because they can't manage substance use there, to focus more on the mental health. Those two work well together if that continuity can happen. And so, historically, we've really separated substance use and mental health. We've siloed these, and that complicates things. Treatment is set up usually for people to kind of start with one and then address the other, but we know that they're really integrated. And it's hard to know, like, which one do I address first? So EATS is a decent level of care to kind of start, I guess, looking at both and helping people do that. It's also a voluntary level of care, so people have to want to be there. So inpatient treatment is our most intense level of psychiatric care. It's our most restrictive level of care, and it's usually dictated by urgent circumstances. When these lower levels of care no longer are enough to support an individual, or maybe a little bit longer term treatment is needed. So it's appropriate for individuals who are at risk of harming themselves, imminent risk of harming themselves, or are in a really kind of acute or significant phase of their mental health symptoms that requires a secure setting, 24-hour observation, and just really, feeling like they're not well maintained in community settings that are voluntary. Typically, individuals stay long enough to be, I'm going to use the term stabilized, but stabilization is from the acute episode. It's not to say that they're better, that the recovery has happened, wellness has happened. It's really, we're looking at several days to maybe up to 2 weeks. Certainly there can be longer stays, but I don't think that's the typical experience before someone is released. And then the recommendation is to then engage in treatment elsewhere, right? So ideally, if we could move between levels of care, someone would be step down to a crisis community crisis stabilization unit, or maybe to a partial hospitalization, and then down to outpatient. But oftentimes those beds aren't available, and so resuming outpatient might be kind of the next step. While people might have individual check-ins and medication management in an inpatient setting, definitely some group therapy, the treatment that happens there is not as intensive, I would say, as an outpatient setting, which may not seem to line up for people, but this deep work, this kind of more intense work that ultimately I think people need to do to move through what they're experiencing, there isn't the time to have that happen on an inpatient unit. There isn't kind of the support to do that in terms of all the other people that are there. And, it's about stabilization. So it's not about kind of churning things up. It's about helping people get back to a better place to then be able to go do that work. So I would say a lot of the individual work that's happening on inpatient psychiatric units is more about planning for discharge and what that needs to look like. And certainly family members and caregivers should and can be part of that, but it's not intensive therapy. As I said, this is the highest level of care. It's the most restrictive, especially when it becomes involuntary, which we'll talk about next. So involuntary hospitalization, also known as civil commitment, it is a legal process. This is a legal process by which a person is confined to a psychiatric hospital against their will. And this is because of a mental health disorder, and because of their risk to self. So commitment standards do vary state to state, but generally the minimum for holding somebody is due to, for evaluation, and then treatment is secondary to concern for risk to self. And usually that is about overt suicide attempt, suicidal ideation, with plan, with means, and also it could be that someone is so impaired by their mental health experience that they're just not able to care for themselves, and that's putting them at risk. So at minimum, the stay is 3 days. Those are business days. You want to think about that. People often get confused by, these are legal documents, and like, I thought I could leave. And really, we're looking at business days. We're also looking at, there's just some nuances in there that I think frustrate people about the process. So typically someone actually ends up staying 5 to 6 days, even if the initial hold was for 3. I have a lot to say about involuntary hospitalization, and I'll speak to a little bit more of it later, because this is my area of research and my background, and I don't have the time to go into all of it that I would like to, but what I want to make sure that people know is that this is a last resort. Having an individual be stripped of their human right and their kind of bodily autonomy and forced into being held in a psychiatric unit, it's a really significant life experience. And for some it's really helpful, and for others it can feel really devastating. So it's not a decision that should be made lightly, but it does exist for a reason. And certainly in times of imminent risk, I find that can be hard to define, but it is necessary. I had done research with individuals who have experienced involuntary civil commitment. They have gone through this process, and everyone I spoke to, certainly had a lot to say about how the process could be improved, but no one said that it shouldn't exist either. So it's just making sure that we know under what circumstances it's really necessary, and being thoughtful and responsible in our process of enacting commitment on someone. And so, that happens by providers, but we also hope that, family members and caretakers can think about this as well, that even though it might feel safer to have somebody kind of in this secure setting, the process of getting there and that experience of having your rights taken away can be really overwhelming. So now we're going to transition to looking at, expectations around treatment. The first thing that I'll say about, whether treatment is working or not, and Dr. Wang kind of referenced this, is there's this kind of rule of thirds out there that talks about one third of individuals gets better on their own. Without treatment. So any one of us at any point in our lives is vulnerable to struggling with mental health symptoms, perhaps even being, diagnosed with a disorder. But we might not necessarily need treatment. We might be able to pull on our own coping skills. We might be able to use our kind of informal natural supports. We might have external events that kind of were causing this, and those start to resolve. And so we don't necessarily need treatment. And then there's a third of individuals who need treatment and respond really well to treatment and, maybe kind of access it here and there, but they kind of move through and do well. And that was their experience. And not saying that it happens overnight, but, it's kind of this like middle group. And then there's a third that struggle a little bit more with responding to treatment, finding the right treatments, and that they may need to be engaged in some form of treatment long-term. Sometimes that's therapy, sometimes that's just having a group support. Oftentimes that can be medication. And so they're more apt to have a longer term engagement, perhaps even lifelong with that. So thinking about, it's really scary and overwhelming, I think, when someone's having a mental health experience, but that because of stigma, I think a lot of times people get stuck in, oh my gosh, this is it, and this is forever, and they can have a really overwhelmed and doomed feeling, and that might not necessarily be, and hopefully won't be, the outcome for people. So as the slide says here, how do we know if treatment's working? Well, I think that's a complex question. Defining working, how do we define working, and who gets to define that? So recovery is going to look different for each person. And I'm a really big believer in looking to clients themselves to say, what are the goals? How do you define recovery, wellness for yourself? How will you know that treatment is being helpful? And I know this can be complicated a little bit by symptoms that someone's experiencing, especially when one of the things that's happening is maybe kind of like negative thinking and just feeling like nothing's working. So maybe then we look at more concrete symptomology, right? So you came in here, you weren't eating, you weren't sleeping, you weren't socializing. Are any of those things changing? Are you utilizing coping skills that maybe you didn't utilize before? So there might be other ways if a person's subjective experience, if the emotional experience that they're having isn't quite lining up yet with maybe some of the changes that are actually happening in their lives. It just makes me think of the kind of classic miracle question. If you woke up tomorrow and you weren't depressed, if you weren't experiencing depression, what would be different? And sometimes, individuals do struggle to even answer that, but this is where family members and caregivers can be so supportive to say, this is what I think would be different, or this is what I see has been different and for you. And maybe that's the changes that we kind of look for to know are things working. When we think about working, treatment working, we also don't want to rush the process. So treatment really does take time, and giving adequate time is important. I often tell individuals that it took X amount of time to get here. I mean, Dr. Wang talked about the, decade often that before people actually access treatment, which is just, is just awful. So we don't want it to take that long to feel better, but understanding the process, making, putting in the time, being patient with it is really important. Also recognizing that therapy is hard, and the time spent there, the work that needs to be done needs to be consistent. So someone might be saying, I've been engaged in therapy for 6 months, but they've only been going sporadically. They haven't been showing up to each session. They've missed a lot of their, partial hospitalization group programming and so forth. And so that's difficult, when there's a lack of continuity. I think about this work really building on itself. That is going to impact when we see change. And the fact that a lot of this work, because it's so difficult and people are sharing really vulnerable aspects of themselves, that taking the time to build a relationship with a provider and developing that trust and feeling comfortable and safe to be able to share really intimate life experiences isn't going to happen overnight. So we do want to give time to that. When it comes to treatment, more does not mean better. Our tendency is to add more. Sometimes we do that right away. It's just like, oh my gosh, things are not good. Try this, try this, try this. That complicates things. We don't exactly know then what's working, like, what that variable might be. Was it everything? Was it one thing? Sometimes we do this when we think change isn't occurring quickly enough or substantially enough. It's like, well, let's add something else in. Professionals, I speak as a professional, we do this all the time. Often it's well intended. It's also, I think, wanting to help. We want there to be this concrete thing that we think may help. And certainly having individuals engaged in outpatient therapy, but also a group therapy or family therapy to kind of support these processes, that can be really complementary. But when we start to mindlessly pile on treatments, often that becomes very overwhelming for people. It can, create a burden for them that may then add to the burden they're already carrying kind of in other ways related to their mental illness. And I think it sets people up to then become labeled as non-compliant or treatment avoidant or resistant, because now they have all of these things that they need to show up for or be doing. And that might be difficult. And if they can't get there or they have other barriers that make it hard, as you start to not attend, that's what we call people. We say they're non-compliant when really there's these whole other reasons for not attending. So trying not to mindlessly add on care. So here's another quick poll: caregivers supporting treatment. So if you just take 30 seconds to look at true or false, caregivers can talk to providers without a signed release. Okay, all right. False. Okay. So we're going to talk about that kind of in part of these slides, and we'll get back to that. So as caregivers, my supporting treatment, my biggest recommendation is having conversations with people before you get to a crisis point. And so one of the things that we have is called an advance directive, a psychiatric advance directive, that you can use formally or informally. This can be between providers and clients. It can be with family members and their loved ones. So, having these conversations of what do you need? What do you want to be able to, how can I support you before you're in that crisis situation is really, really helpful. At the very least, it generates conversations. You can feel better about how you're supporting, even if you're getting to places where, you're looking at higher levels of care, involuntary levels of care. Next slide. So in terms of releases, we do want them whenever possible because we want people to make that conscious decision to say, like, I want you involved in my care. But actually communication can happen, without a release. Caregivers can still share information with providers. A provider cannot confirm that they are, your loved one's therapist or whatever role they play, but they can take information from you. And then maybe encourage their client to say, let's get a release. This is really helpful. I also want people to know that under HIPAA, information related to risk can always be shared. So knowing that, don't hesitate to reach out when you have concerns, and certainly reminding your loved ones that even with release of information, information is shared from providers on a need to know basis. So, provider therapists and so forth aren't calling up loved ones and giving all the information about what happens in session and what's going on. It's really need to know, and they can be revoked at any time. So if someone gets uncomfortable with it, they can say, nope, I'm taking back the release. I'd like to just quickly add in a piece about human rights. And I think this is a role for caregivers in supporting their loved ones to know that, mental health and access to mental health treatment is a fundamental human right. And so, making sure that if people are experiencing barriers or feel like they're getting the runaround, that like they are advocating for that, for what they should have access to. Agencies, hospitals, all these different settings will have human rights officers. Individuals should be provided with human rights forms that they can review to say, if they feel like their human rights were violated. So there are avenues if you feel like individuals are not getting the treatment that they need, and or in the course of treatment, they feel like they're experiencing a lot of coercion or are not being listened to or things like that. So I just like to add that in. So part of taking care of others is taking care of ourselves. I think that seems obvious. We all know kind of the airplane analogy of, when the oxygen drops, you put it on yourself before you then try to take care of someone else. I mean, we really need to be caring for ourselves to be able to be in the best possible place to then support our loved ones through what they're experiencing. So reaching out for help for yourself, that can be formal or informal, recognizing your own limitations and setting those boundaries. And just because you do that once doesn't mean it stays that way forever. So revisiting conversations and what you think you can handle over periods of time, and then educating yourself from reputable mainstream sources, as well as from those who have lived experience, and kind of being able to hear from both camps to feel like you have enough information, to support your loved ones. I mean, I think in many ways we could, all go get a degree in this and still feel like we don't have enough information. But anything that you can do, I think having as much information as possible also helps you to manage your expectations and hopes for your loved one moving forward. Additionally, there's just practical ways to support, doing some research on choosing providers, looking up, different medications, feedback from people who have worked with different agencies or gone through different programs, learning about the human rights issues, I think is really important. Identifying, wait lists are really frustrating. I think this is also a negative outcome of piling on services, because when we just start referring people to things, we increase wait lists and then people don't have access. But so navigating these systems takes a lot, and realizing like you can kind of be calling, you can email, follow up, do those things to kind of help stay on top of information. Insurance companies can be wonderful resources, still difficult to navigate, but they're going to tell you who's in network. They may tell you who has openings. Outpatient providers in general tend to be unfamiliar with what specific insurance companies will cover. So they may inadvertently say, hey, you should do partial hospitalization because this would be a great level of care. And then you find out your insurance company doesn't cover that. So calling your insurance company, there's much more of a burden on consumers now to kind of know this, which is unfortunate, but doing that homework, they may have particular people there that like case managers and stuff that can just work directly with you. You will need a release from your loved one if you are going to be the one to call the insurance company and talk with them that they can do that. Help. I think this is important. Help isn't always helpful, right? There's like kind of this allure that certain levels of care, particularly inpatient hospitalization, is going to be the end all be all and really help to fix. And that isn't always the case. So just knowing that sometimes the best or highest quality or safest or, whatever it might be, isn't necessarily going to be the right thing for your loved one. And that isn't about them, and just staying kind of more consistent to find what is going to be the right fit for them. This does take a lot of legwork, but when we get really over invested, we can also then be really, really disappointed if it didn't work or didn't work the way that we had hoped or thought it might. Just, crisis support, I already kind of talked a little bit about this, but it is a resource in your states, and it's not just when things get to that kind of escalated point. So, using it as a resource, please know that it's there. Crisis teams even will have the opportunity to gather information. And if you thought your loved one was going into crisis and you needed them to have certain information in case they couldn't access you in the middle of the night or, whenever it might be, they can house that in their documentation systems to be able to access should your loved one come into crisis. So recovery is a process, and it's a very individual, highly personal process. It may include formal clinical treatment, medications, faith-based approaches, family support, self-care support. I mean, there's so many things. So it's really looking to your loved one to say, like, what is recovery to you, and kind of what do you think the pathway might be to get to it? And holding on to the fact, the reality that setbacks are a part of the process. Recovery is not a straightforward kind of linear process oftentimes, and not allowing our loved ones and ourselves to get really discouraged if it's one step forward, two steps back kind of movement. And it's really complex. We started talking about how much of what people are experiencing is contextualized, right? So 4 major dimensions of recovery, looking at someone's health, overcoming and managing kind of their symptoms. This can be mental health symptoms. This can be physical health symptoms that really exacerbate mental health or vice versa. Having stable places to live, that makes a huge difference. Having a purpose. This doesn't have to be, top CEO of this company or whatever, but people finding their purpose and feeling like, they have a role in the world that feels significant to them, and being able to be part of community. So having relationships, having social connections, friendships, love, hope. We know we are connected beings. That's what we need. We need others. And depression isolates us. It pulls us from that. So helping someone identify community and reconnect is really important. And for all of us, keeping balance and staying hopeful, that can be challenging for sure. It's really difficult to see our loved ones experiencing these struggles and these challenges, and not knowing kind of what comes next. I also think sometimes our lives can become consumed by the mental health disorder and the pursuit of treatment and wellness, but that we want to make sure that our loved ones are not only seen as their mental health condition, and that we're not only engaging with them in that way and helping them have some balance as well as ourselves as we support them on their journey.
Thank you so much, Dr. Clark. We're going to let you take a breath while we get ready for our Q&A. We're also going to put up one more poll. This is something you should be taking right now, sorry. So everybody, please look at your screens. Hopefully, oh, I think some people have learned a lot from our presentation. That's good to see. Give you another 5 seconds. We definitely moved up all the people, I think, who didn't know as much in the beginning, and now a significant number of you know a lot about supporting a loved one going through depression treatment. So that is awesome. We are so happy to see that. Thank you to those of you who have already submitted questions. While I talk over the next couple of slides, if people want to submit questions to Dr. Clark or Dr. Wang or both of them, please go ahead and do that as I go through a couple of things. You might have learned something today that you want to use to help move your family into action to support your loved one living with depression. We offer a great tool, our family action plan. We have a template that you can use, and I think it's going to be in the chat. It's already in the chat, I think. So feel free to use that in helping to move the family forward on issues of treatment or anything else. So definitely take a look at that resource. We have other amazing webinars in our library of content, and they're all aimed at family caregivers. We have content on adult depression, on communication, on bipolar disorder. So there's also a list of some of the other topics that we've covered in the past with experts who have given of their time and expertise to help families. So definitely look at our familyware.org/trainings library of resources to see more information that might be helpful to you. I'm going to remind you now and again at the end to take our survey so that you can receive a copy of our Coping with Stress, Adult Depression, and Preventing Suicides brochures. You will have those mailed to you as our thanks for filling out the survey. And that survey link will be in the chat multiple times. Again, put your questions in as I go through our thank yous. We want to thank our funders of our education. We wouldn't be able to do our programming without our funders. That includes the Takeda Lundbeck Alliance, Sage Therapeutics, GeneSight, Alchemez, Pear Therapeutics, Janssen Neuroscience, and the Massachusetts Department of Public Health. Thank you to all of those funders, as well as people just like you who make donations to support our organization and our education. A special thanks to our presenters, Dr. Wang and Dr. Clark. And again, you can make donations to support us. Let's go to the Q&A now. There were folks who were putting stuff in the chat, but we also got some wonderful questions at registration as people were getting ready to attend our webinar. So one question is, what signs should you watch for that your loved one's treatment is no longer working? What can you see? What can you observe? What are some of those telltale signs that whatever process that may have helped them before is no longer, or whatever modality helped them before is no longer helping them?
Well, I'll start, a reemergence of symptoms, certainly, and not functioning, not functioning in the different roles that they may, play in their family, workplace, community. I would say, between those would be warning signs.
Okay, great. We're going to take one more from our registration, and then we'll move to some of the questions that were submitted today. How do you address denial of symptoms or diagnosis? We talk a lot about the stages of change. Sometimes the caregiver recognizes that their loved one may need treatment, may need to address depression, but the loved one, for whatever reason, does not agree and doesn't see that. What is your suggestion to family caregivers, family members, if their loved one doesn't believe that they need any help?
Either one of us. I think it's a really, really difficult spot to be in. And we also know that forcing treatment for many people becomes more problematic for them. And so, having conversations to say, like, I'd like to continue to check in. I'd like to, give you my feedback if you're open to it. I'm here to support you if and when you're ready. And then also, I think that's where kind of getting the support for ourselves and whether it's formal treatment. I mean, that's part of my recommendation to say, like, how do I cope with this? Because it's really, really difficult to see our loved one, headed down a path or on a path that feels like we could divert this, or we could really, there are things that could be really helpful, and they're just not in a place where they're ready to take that in. Certainly, if you get to places of imminent concern, there are other avenues, and part of that might be talking through that with a provider to say, like, when is that tipping point? What should I be looking for to intervene and talk to a crisis, service or so forth.
Yeah, I agree. With Dr. Clark, you can't force people into treatment, even if it's, everyone would agree it would be the right thing. I just want to comment on your insight, Valerie, around the stages of change. That's a for those who aren't familiar with this. This is a it comes out of the substance use treatment world, but it's found applicability across the treatments for mental disorders. And what you want to do is it's basically what Dr. Clark was saying. You want to meet people where they are. What are they willing to do? Well, they may not be willing to do everything, but maybe there are things that feel right or feel comfortable, and you want to work with that. So, many clinicians are trained in using this approach. It's a formal technique. It's called motivational interviewing. It's where you assess their readiness for change. What are they willing to do? And you meet them there. And ideally, it isn't confrontational. It becomes collaborative.
Thank you both for those excellent answers. We have a participant today who submitted this question. My adult daughter does not tell me the truth about her treatment. We don't know if she follows the treatment protocol she's supposed to be following. I know I don't have a legal way to check on what's going on, but do you have a recommendation how to open her up to talk about the truth? So I'm assuming this, yeah, she said an adult daughter. This is an adult, so the parental ability to ask questions may, is not there legally. And sometimes that's not even, you're not even able to do it if you're still the legal parent, the guardian over an under 18-year-old. Sometimes they still may not tell you the truth. So what advice do you have for this mother whose adult daughter doesn't feel like she wants to be open with her about whether or not she's following the treatment protocol she's supposed to be following?
Certainly kind of depends on the relationship dynamics and kind of what is that typical? Does she share other things with you and not this, and maybe trying to understand that a little better, or if she's more kind of closed off? I mean, adult children, it's hard, when we're striving for independence, when we kind of want to be able to do things on our own, when we don't want our parents in our business. Some of that is just kind of developmentally appropriate. I'm not exactly sure her age, but so maybe there's an opportunity. If it's not you, is there somebody that she feels comfortable talking to, that you can at least know that she's opening up, or that she feels like she has someone to go to if she's not following through, or she's struggling, or whatever it might be. But there's no forcing her to tell you. And I would guess, because this has been the feedback for many people, that, the more we kind of pull for, the more pushback that we get, the more secretive people get. And so trying to, at some point, ask her, I'm going crazy over here wanting to know, how can I support you, and also kind of just feel like you're okay? Or if you're not okay, what will happen? What will you do?
I think this harkens back to something I believe you said earlier about you don't want to wait for a crisis to happen to start planning for a crisis. I think there are some parallels here. Your communication, that base foundation of communication should be strong, or it's something to work on to make it strong, so that when there are topics that someone could be a little bit more sensitive about, you're not using that time as the opportunity to build the communication and to hear what you need from that loved one. That's something that came out of the series we did on communication. You want to be establishing those good practices, that solid foundation, so that when these tougher conversations come up, there's trust, there's a language, a shorthand between you, and you can get the information that you want to know without damaging the relationship.
Yeah. Yeah. So looking for those inlets, even now that you're in this situation, are there times that are perhaps more calm, or, that you can try to establish those?
Yeah. I think we have time for maybe 2 more questions. We have another participant who wants to know, how successful has introducing a pet, especially dogs, been to mitigating to some extent depression symptoms? In my experience, if connection and belonging are major issues for individuals, pets can provide significant improvement. Can we let pets take the place of pesky humans? Or do they play a completely different role? Do you need pet interaction and human interaction when trying to mitigate depression symptoms? What can we say to this person?
I don't know if Dr. Wang has formal research on this. I don't, but I love this question because I think pets can be so wonderful. When we talk about connection, they are similar to humans. My only caution, I guess, would be kind of that burden of then caretaking, right? So if I'm in a position where I'm struggling to take care of myself, am I then now ready for that responsibility to care for another living being? For some people, yes, that pulls me out of myself. It pulls me out of my head, out of my depression. I have a purpose, right? That last slide, one of the last slides talked about a purpose. For others, it could just be too overwhelming. So my thinking would be timing. And if there's others in the household that can support caretaking of the pet, then it could be a wonderful addition. But that's based on no research, formal research.
Yeah, I actually, we did to support some research on using pets, as kind of adjuncts, to treatment. But obviously, there's nothing definitive to say. I do think, though, the what you presented earlier, that just as humans, we need connection. We need connection to other beings. We need community. We do need a sense of purpose. Often, our we have a lot invested in, the role of caring for someone. Even if you're depressed, if you see your role as caring, well, that's good. I mean, it's so. I don't know specifically, but I would say, if you like, four-legged, creatures, as I do, and as I think Dr. Clark, we heard you do too. Yeah, it can certainly help you feel connected and give you a sense of purpose.
Excellent. One more question, and then we will have to conclude. So there is somebody who has a loved one who uses public insurance, and they are wondering if they can find a good doctor who accepts public insurance. That seems to be a bit of a systems question. There are many different reasons why certain providers accept public insurance and others don't. So they need one who can do specific things to help their loved one. But I think they may be having trouble finding one who accepts, in their case, Medicaid, but this could be this could reverberate out to Medicare probably as well. So what do you say about finding providers who will accept public insurance?
Well, maybe I'll take a shot, but I think there's not only a workforce shortage, there's a shortage of providers who accept insurance, and there's a shortage particularly of providers who will accept public insurance. And some of that has to do with reimbursement rates. So, you know, it's a complex policy problem, but, you know, it probably needs to involve, you know, increasing reimbursement rates, particularly for publicly insured patients, to the point where providers, you know, aren't, I mean, literally taking a pay cut to treat folks, for example, who are on Medicaid. I think then there's, you know, as Dr. Clark alluded to, there are all kinds of hurdles. You know, you know, when you seek treatment, you have to look for who's a network provider. So in other words, like, for example, if you have a certain insurer, they have like a list that you have to go find that lists the say psychiatrists that, you know, are on their in their network, and then you have to start calling them. But there have been actually studies of where mock patients have, you know, tried to reach these providers. Some of them, you know, long moved on. They're not a part of the, you know, and some are hard to reach. And even when you reach them, they're booked until, you know, for 6 months. And so it's a very challenging, especially when you're in crisis or you're experiencing, you know, an episode of mental illness. It's a very, very challenging, often accessing. So it's a situation that definitely needs to be improved.
Agreed. And that's where, again, caregivers can play such a crucial role. I mean, it may come down to calling everybody who you see online. It says they accept your public insurance, and just going down that list, because if a person is dealing with some symptoms of depression, that task in and of itself can feel so daunting that they wouldn't be able to follow through with it. So caregivers can play a really crucial role in doing all of that legwork, and then saying, look, I found 2 providers. I can only find 2, but here are 2 that accept our form of Medicaid and that specialize in what you need. And then you try them out, and hopefully you find a match. But thank you, Dr. Wang, for that answer, and Dr. Clark for your answers as well. We appreciate the expertise that you shared with our audience. And thank you, everyone who has watched. We will conclude our program at this time. You can visit us at familyaware.org for more resources. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.